Welcome to Chatter. I'm David Priess. This week, international politics and security expert Ben Tallis on German grand strategy and Kraftwerk.
But on the musical front, there's then this double resentment, if you like. One is against the homegrown pop music, which is just god-awful, and no one who wants to rebel in their own right mind would listen to this stuff. The other is against the music of the occupiers. But where was their own voice? And there's a couple of interviews with the guys from Kraftwerk talking directly about this, saying it's one thing to love the Beatles, and we do, but it's another thing to make something of your own. So they wanted to actually make something that could again be German. So again, how do I say this in a German way? Was the big question. Look, that speech was written and given in a moment of panic in Berlin. It was a time when it looked like Kiev was going to fall and that an emboldened Russia would be knocking at the door. And so it's time to get serious. The Ukrainians fight back and buy time, and the air goes out of this process of change almost completely.
Hi, Ben. Good to see you again.
Hey, David. Nice to see you too.
Yes, this is Dr. Ben Tallis is joining us on Chatter today, and I'm going to start this with something that'll sound very strange to listeners without the context of what we're going to be talking about later. But what music did you grow up listening to?
Well, what did I grow up listening to? I grew up listening to a lot of classical music in my family home. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of Schubert, a lot of Mozart, Pachelbel, a lot of the Romantics, actually. There was, classical music of all kinds, and a lot of German music now, actually, I think about it. But then there was a lot of pop music too. My parents are both kids who grew up into their teenage years in the 60s, and we got the benefit of that. But moving to Manchester was the big thing.
When was that?
We moved there in 88, so I would have been 8 at that time. And that's Music City. I mean, that is, as famously one guy called Mark Radcliffe said, it's a city that thinks the table's for dancing on. And this that's reflected in the music culture. So I saw a load of the indie and Britpop bands in the 90s. Mm-hmm. We caught the back end of the Hacienda and the sort of Summer of Love, the first explosion of UK house and trance music. Mm-hmm. But our group was more into indie music and that Britpop stuff, and then actually a lot of hip hop. We used to be the archetypal white kids driving around in a battered up Peugeot in the Manchester suburbs listening to hip hop.
I'm picturing you. I don't know if you've seen the movie Office Space. It's a movie, the mock-up of, making fun of U.S., especially corporate culture. And it's got the white guy driving down the street playing the gangster rap and then slowly rolling up his window when he sees people noticing him. And then that's how I now see you.
That was us without the window going up.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. The range of exposure as a kid, I think, does open one up to, more exploration of music growing up. I mean, I didn't realize it at the time, but my father listened to classical music a lot, and I didn't listen to it myself actively. That is, they didn't create like a listening club every Wednesday night where we commented on Bach and why this worked and this didn't. But later on in life, I think I appreciate it more because I was exposed to it. But what I liked was just the pop rock music of the late 80s, mid to late 80s was my formative period. And because of that, I was not really into electronic music. And because I was there for the hair metal era of the mid 80s when synthesizers and keyboards were considered evil, I didn't really appreciate electronic music much. And then, years later, a couple of months ago, I run into you in Helsinki and we're having a conversation about, international security, our main area. And then somehow we ended up talking about Kraftwerk and other music. And I realized we need to have a chatter conversation because you have actually studied the intersection of music and national identity and international relations in a way that is peak chatter. So thank you for indulging me with a little bit about the background of your own personal music history. Let's get to the international relations side of your history. How did you decide to study international politics, and what did you first focus on?
I've tried quite a few things in my life, not just musically, but also career-wise. And I'm a fairly competitive person. And when I was at a sort of stage of high school, trying to decide what to do, I was really into economics and understanding the world through economics. And the most competitive thing you could do with an economics degree that I then went on to study was to go and be an investment banker and to try and get a job in banking,
Sure.
which I did and then hated.
Did you hate it first day, or did it take a while to sink in how horrible it was?
No, it took a while. I tried being hateful enough to fit in, first of all, tried to ape all the mentalities. It wasn't quite sort of British psycho, but it was all of the cliches of investment banking, really. And yeah, it didn't fulfill me because I'd always had a political side as well. I'd always been interested in politics, but had never really found the right route to studying it. And so then I thought to myself, what do I want to do? What do I believe in? Which is a question not every investment banker perhaps asks in front of the mirror in the morning or at other times a day. And I thought, I believe in what the EU is doing. How do I get into working for that? And so this was 2002. So it was at a time when the EU was perhaps at the peak of its powers, actually, on the way to the Eastern enlargement in 2004. And I thought, okay, how do I get into this? And I went and studied a master's in European studies and had the wonderful experience there of living in Prague for 6 months, as well as then in the UK for the other half of the degree, and became aware of something called the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And they were doing internships, and they made the fateful choice to take me as an intern down on the so-called spillover monitor mission in Skopje, in what is now North Macedonia. And so I pitched up there with honestly not much of an idea what I was going to be doing or not much of an idea about the place. And no one was there to meet me at the airport. And so I kind of had to draw on then my high school German to speak to a taxi driver and navigate the way around town. Having gone through two of the previous OSCE headquarters, I finally turned up at the right place, but it's Sunday and there's no one there. Then a confused Irish colonel turns up on the door. So he's like, "Who are you and what are you doing here?" "Oh, God, come back tomorrow." So I went and got a hotel, came back the next day, and then spent 3 months working as an intern in the police development unit. And just before I arrived, two analysts had left. And they looked at my CV, and if you're a banker, it says analyst is your basic level job. So they said, "Oh, you're an analyst, you can do this." Sure.
Which you could. You know?
Yeah. So gave it a crack, spent all day working long hours, learning everything I could about Macedonia, about the conflict there, and about community policing, which was the particular part of the project that I was working on. The reintroduction of police into former combat areas, using the police as a force for good rather than a force of oppression, and so on. And I ended up writing a report that saved the mission's budget about 2 months later, which was taken by the ambassador to Vienna. And he came back and he was waving this report through the department. He said, "Yeah, you did great, kid. This is awesome." And by that time, I knew enough people around the place because I'd spent every evening in the Irish pub there, which is where you got to know the internationals. So to St. Patrick's in the Skopje shopping centre.
Where the real work gets done.
Well, precisely, right? I mean, this is where the network got built. And through that network and that report, I then got hired to work on the EU mission that they were setting up down there as the head of analysis. So one thing led to another, went into that. It started off with the Balkans. It really moved into foreign and security policy more broadly.
So before you went to Macedonia, did you have any interest in the Balkans in general, or in, Skopje in particular, or that was just fortuitous?
Well, I mean, at the same time I was actually getting into house music and electronic music at university, the late 90s, of course, the TV was absolutely full of reports from the Balkans. You couldn't grow up in the 90s without noticing the humanitarian crises one after another, but also the highly complex politics of the place. So going from Croatia declaring independence into then the full Bosnian war, and then Kosovo as in the late 90s, these were things that left an impact and left a mark. And so I did have some residual awareness. And Skopje, actually, there's a bit of family history. My mum raised money for the earthquake victims back in 1963 as a teenager in Croydon in South London. And so that was something I did know where Skopje was. I knew my parents had been there. My dad had been there when traveling through Yugoslavia. And he always told stories about traveling in Yugoslavia, but I'd never been. I didn't know, apart from all the TV reports of the 90s, but I had the idea that the international community was doing something good there.
And in the time since then, you've hit a number of different topics in your research and writing, from international relations theory to pan-European issues, German foreign policy in particular, a whole range of things. It seems like you're able to chase things that you find interesting as events demand them, which is energizing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, there's two aspects to that. One is the world's an interesting place, so there's lots of different ways to access it, be that through culture, politics, different forms of foreign policy, domestic policy, or so on. And I think it helps to have a rounded understanding of these things when trying to not only understand, but also to help make recommendations to make things better. So I think there's a conscious effort on my part to pursue those things, but it also comes from that interest that's sparked. The other aspect is chasing what I think is the most important, and where is the front line that I can make the biggest dent in at each particular time. And that's one of the reasons I'm in Germany, because I think the political battle here matters for the future of European security, for the future of the free world. Yeah. So although there are some occasional frustrations to living here, I nonetheless think that it's worth staying here. I came here for both professional and personal reasons, stayed for personal reasons, but also now for these professional reasons of thinking it's the most important place to do my work.
You know, I really want to dig down deep on that because, well, for two reasons. One is I think you're right, fundamentally. I think that Germany as a body politic, as a leadership cadre, really needs to decide the role they will play in the future, given everything that's happened, especially in recent years. I just agree with you fundamentally. But secondly, it's an area that I have not focused on in my studies and my research. German foreign policy is almost an empty slate for me. So I want to learn, and you've written and researched a lot about it. Walk us through the background to the current situation, but specifically the 1950s, 1960s. Describe the German experience after the Second World War, not in terms of reconstruction and on the ground, but in terms of German elite and popular views of their place in the world for the roughly couple of decades after the end of the war.
Thanks for asking, because I think this is one of the most fascinating things to try and understand where Germany's come from, where it is. And I'm glad you agree that I'm right, by the way. That's always nice to
I'll disagree with you on everything else.
Bring it on. Very good. So Germany lost the Second World War in spectacular fashion. I mean, we know what the Nazis did. We know what Hitler did. We know what Germans did as part of that. The mass industrialized murder of Jews and others across Europe, laying waste to a continent with imperial ambition. And in 1945, that was pushed back and Germany was occupied. And Germans were really sinners in the eyes of the world at this point. There was a country and a culture in ruins. There was, and you could see that in the cities at the time. They were destroyed. The RAF and the USAF, with their inaccurate bombing, still managed to lay waste to large parts of Germany. But also the whole German model was in crisis. It's what Germans refer to as Stunden Null, or the 0 hour. Mm-hmm. And there was a conscious effort then to rebuild, as you said, to reconstruct. But this had a significant foreign policy dimension that was known as Westbindung, or integration with the West, binding to the West, which was pioneered by Konrad Adenauer, who was the Christian Democrat Chancellor. Before the war, he'd been mayor of Cologne. Then he headed a sequence of governments after the war, after German statehood was restored in 1949 by the occupying powers. And they pursued this strategy of Westbindung. And remember, this was a time of Cold War confrontation. There was a real concern about which way Germany would go. You had the German Democratic Republic, the misnamed Soviet satellite state that had been the part that the Soviets had occupied, and then West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany. And there was real concern about which way this would go. But Adenauer and his group were really convinced that their future lay in the West. And that securing that future meant a few different things. It meant economic renewal. So the Wirtschaftswunder, as it's known, the economic miracle, getting materially back on your feet after the destruction, rebuilding German industry, which of course the Marshall Plan helped with massively. But it also meant institutional belonging. It meant a membership of NATO eventually, which was realized in 1955. It meant setting up the European Union. So from the 1949 Declaration 1951 through to 1957 Treaty of Rome, you get the emergence of what became later the European Union. And you get Germany rearming to play its role as a frontline state, as well as retooling economically. But the missing part of this was a cultural renewal and a cultural reckoning for what had passed. And this, when I first started looking into this, I was absolutely fascinated, because for me, growing up I was born in 1979, growing up in the 80s and 90s, Germany was really a place to look up to. It was somewhere that was advanced. It was somewhere that was not quite cool at that time, less necessarily, but it was somewhere to be admired. And so going back into this period and looking at where Germany had come from, and understanding that not only that economic renewal, but a cultural renewal that had to happen, which came a bit later, was really a fascinating thing. And that was about reckoning with the Nazi past in everyday life. But it was also about saying, what does it mean to be German? And how do we say ich und wir, I and we, and mean German? How is it okay again to speak in German internationally after Auschwitz is basically the question that Germans were wrestling with. And that goes across film, across music, and that's where I get into it with Kraftwerk and the so-called Krautrock movement. But you can see it in film, you can see it in literature too. And that cultural renewal, together with the moral reckoning that it brought for Germans, is something I think that's admired around the world. And so that period, 45, from a country in ruins and sinners in the eyes of the world, to 89, the capital of freedom and one of the most admired liberal democracies in the world, is really a heck of a transition that needs to be understood if you're going to understand where Germany is now too.
I want to go back a couple of steps there, and then cover all of that. So my shallow impression of this is that in the period from the late 40s, really going into the 1970s, that to the extent that there were German thinkers trying to figure out what is Germany's place in the world, it wasn't about leadership ever. It was always about binding the country and institutions with other Europeans. It was about, in a sense, followership. How are we going to follow the lead of the United States in security, of a wider European entity with coal and steel community followed by integration? That if there were Germans thinking about how can we play a leadership role in the world, they quickly, consciously or not, directed that thinking into business and to, we'll just put our heads down and be efficient, not try to think of creative ways to regain a leadership role. And I've never really understood that except as a natural extension of the experience in the Second World War, when German leadership wasn't really appreciated and would not have been appreciated for quite some time. But is there more to it than that? Was there something in the German educational system or something within the political structures that were created that made it harder for a chancellor within that system, or made it harder for the political system as a whole to do big, grand strategy thinking?
Such an interesting question. And the point about followership is very well taken, and it's something I'd like to pick up on with you later as well. Mm-hmm. I think there was grand strategy thinking, and this is what's now been denied in more recent times. That it's widely claimed, and we wrote a piece earlier this year saying Germany needs a strategy, grand and democratic. The first comment I got on this on Twitter was fascist when I wrote this.
There you go.
If I'm talking about strategy in Germany, it must be a fascist, which is of course nonsense. But there is an aversion to that, and that was from a German commentator. It must be emphasized, because strategy has come to be associated with people like Carl Schmitt, with Haushofer and the others, the Munich School of Geopolitics, that is widely seen to have led to the bad old ways of German leadership, as you put it there, German imperial ambition, the domination of space and race, in effect. And so that is something that there is an aversion to, but simply claiming that since that time that hasn't happened is not true, because Westbindung itself, this West binding to the West, was a grand strategy realized through diplomatic, economic, institutional, security and defense means, all channeled in the aim of a particular objective. There was also a subsequent grand strategy of Ostpolitik, which now people have come to talk about Ostpolitik in a way that I think misunderstands what the original actually was. That from a place of strength, Germany could effect influence on the states in between Germany and the Soviet Union.
And Ben, remind us all of the time frame and the instigator, if you will, of Ostpolitik.
Sure, it was Willy Brandt, who was Chancellor in the late 60s to the mid 70s. So between the CDU-led governments of the mid 60s up until Helmut Schmidt taking over in 1974. So he launched something called Ostpolitik, which was about rapprochement and building closer relations with the East, but again doing so from a position of strength and from an understanding that the two different economic systems created a particular kind of relation between Germany and West Germany and East Germany, and also West Germany and the Soviet satellites, so the communist bloc. And also included, of course, Willy Brandt's famous knee fall, as it's known, the Kniefall in Warsaw, paying respect to the monument for the Warsaw uprising. Again, apologizing while projecting strength through strategy. Now, so this thing about not having strategy, I don't think is true. It's something, as I say, has come to be denied later. I think also you have to assess that followership. Everyone in European NATO was following the US at that time, and there was no other option. But at the same time, I think actually we've got a situation during the Cold War where NATO was truly an alliance. Even though the US was first among equals, there was an alliance where others contributed. It's after the Cold War that NATO truly became a US protectorate, with others doing less and free riding to a more significant extent. So followership, yes, but for a reason. And in the European Union context and what would become the EU, Germany did exercise leadership. And it's a European Union built in Germany's image in many ways. And Germany is the biggest beneficiary of that European Union. So exercising power through denial, if you like, was a modus operandi for Germany in that time.
Yeah. Well, going back to one issue you mentioned before I took us backward a step, when we get to the 1970s, in the kind of the intersection of pop culture and political thinking and national identity, you'd had things like, obviously, the Beatles, right, and the huge influence they had, and you had the popularity of American pop and rock in the 50s and especially early 60s. But you didn't really have a strong German music scene at the same level, despite population, immense cultural history that should lead to the same kind of musical renaissance that happened in the English-speaking countries. But then something happened, and you've opened my eyes to this because I hadn't really thought about the importance of music beyond just for entertainment, but the intersection of music and national identity and assertiveness and defining one's role. Talk a little bit about first of all, the what was, I think, termed in a derogatory way initially, the Krautrock movement, but then how merging that with, a Bauhaus sensibility and emerging technology, you got Kraftwerk and all of that. Walk us through those first few steps and how it is that suddenly we do get someone trying to figure out what Germany is and what it can be using music and art as a vehicle.
Yeah, this is a fascinating period because you have the kids who are growing up, the baby boomers, as they'd be known in the US and in the UK, kids born in, say, 1946, who in the 50s are growing up, and there's radio playing throughout Germany, and it's American Forces Radio or it's British Forces Radio. And so you get Elvis Presley on there, you get rock and roll, you get the rebellion that is rock and roll against conservative parents of the 1950s happening in the US, happening in the UK, same thing in Germany, but it's with American or British music. It's not being sung in German. The parents at that time are listening to some stuff, god-awful stuff called Schlager, which is literally a play on hits. And if your listeners want some anti-recommendations for this, go and search for Dörte, and if you put in Düsseldorf Playboy, that will come up. And the name itself gives you some some clue. Or Heino, and is another great one to look for. And this music is kind of, if you were to imagine in a British context, Cliff Richard or someone like that. So really twee, really tacky.
Really boring for the teenagers who want something more energetic.
Exactly, totally lame. Parental approved pop music. It's absolute dross, frankly speaking. But that's the German language music that's available going into the early 60s and through most of the 60s, which compared to the Beatles at that time or compared to the Stones or so on, is not really going to cut it if you're an open-minded teenager looking to stick it to the man at that time. And the understanding among loads of those teenagers was the man in Germany really needed it sticking to, because a lot of that man was the same guy who had been doing the stuff the Nazis had been doing. And there hadn't been that full reckoning, that full denazification. Judges, teachers, authority figures all around were often still people from that period. So there was consciousness that rebellion was needed, very much so. And perhaps
that's such an interesting dynamic, Ben. I'm going to pause you there because I don't think I had processed that. To me, I had the idea that, yes, there was some societal repression, if you will, and some unwillingness to talk as openly about the past as perhaps would have been fruitful for healing. But I didn't really get the sense that people growing up really sensed that and resented it as part of the system. I thought it was just the same as, France 68, United States, flower power, but it actually did have that post-Nazi link.
Yeah, exactly. I think it cut a lot harder in Germany. And there was a realization that moral and cultural reckoning hadn't taken place, which is why you get the explosion in Germany in 68 in a slightly different way than you do in the US, UK, and France. And where you get it carried over into the 70s and that cultural renaissance that comes with people like Rainer Werner Fassbinder, Wim Wenders in their films, which reckon with the legacies of Nazism. But on the musical front, there's then this double resentment, if you like. One is against the homegrown pop music, which is just god-awful, and no one who wants to rebel in their own right mind would listen to this stuff. And the other is against the music of the occupiers, frankly speaking, which everyone, I think, in Germany knew why they'd been occupied. But where was their own voice in this? Where was their own way of saying, we want to remake Germany in our own image? And there's a couple of interviews with the guys from Kraftwerk and from Can and other leading bands that came to be in the late 60s and early 70s, talking directly about this, saying it's one thing to love the Beatles, and we do. We listen to this in Hamburg, we listen to this in Düsseldorf, but it's another thing to make something of your own. And so they wanted to actually make something that could again be German. So again, how do I say this in a German way? Was the big question.
Yeah, that's amazing that there was that conscious realization at the time, presumably, not just reflecting back on it in interviews. So how did that come about? How did the band basically go from just starting to make music a little more, what would I say, atmospheric, almost like progressive, a little more feeling like some softer Pink Floyd or pastoral Genesis, early Genesis stuff, but then within a few years transitioning to the Autobahn Trans-Europe Express that people have heard that became so iconic and important?
It comes out of the free jazz scene. And a lot of the music that was going around that scene, you can see in the transfer of drummers between different bands at the time. So Jackie Liebertzeit, who was one of the leading free jazz drummers in Germany, ends up being the drummer for Can. And of course, free jazz was about letting go of standard Western constructions of music, of verse, chorus, structure, etc., of progressive melodic instrumentation, etc. And so there was a lot of really experimental music that was made, a lot of which was totally awful and just endless indulgent noodling rubbish. And so this is what I think got Kraftwerk thinking was, how do we actually make an impact here? How do we make art, but also how do we make pop? And that's the difference between Kraftwerk and, say, Karlheinz Stockhausen or the experimental composers. He wrote famously the Symphony for Helicopters and other such things, which well worth a listen. And so their goal was slightly different, and they became, I think, more disciplined than a lot of the others that grew out of the sort of cosmic wave of music, the more psychedelic influenced music, as you said. And there was crossover there. And they did this in two ways. One was to embrace the new musical technologies that were there and to understand the potential of making sounds that had never been heard before as a way of newly expressing themselves by using the new electronic instruments that were possible and by building some of them actually themselves. It's an urban legend that I've not been able to verify that they built the first drum machine or the first electronic drums, rather.
I know there was some tinkering going on that, and I can't remember which of the members, but one of them in particular was just really interested in just rewiring things and putting this into here and seeing how it affected the sound. And all bands do that with different amps and pedals, sure. But in this case, it was either inventing or virtually inventing new ways of synthesizing.
It was, absolutely. And also understanding how you can relate that to daily life. Mm-hmm. And so taking the sounds of the Federal Republic at the time and taking themes of the Federal Republic. So as you said, Autobahn, which had, of course, been the streets of the Führer, the Straße des Führers, built in the Nazi period. And so there was a symbol of the legacy of the Nazi period in daily life. It was also about what you do on a daily basis in Germany, driving between the big cities. And they take some inspiration from this, but then make it into a musical creation, something that has a different kind of beat, the so-called motoric beat, which was pioneered by some friends of theirs in the band Neu, who were briefly in the band Kraftwerk as well. It takes a different kind of beat, different kinds of instruments, different subject material. So this isn't sort of bubblegum pop stuff. It's about the Autobahn.
Yeah. Going back and re-listening to some of this before our chat here, I was surprised by a couple of things, especially with the early work. Not the couple, the early, free jazz, progressive sounding stuff, but once they got to Autobahn and the others. First of all, it seems very self-conscious. That is, it's not like a band getting together in a garage and just jamming. They're thinking about making art. And in my experience, musical artists, especially in the pop and rock realm, who are thinking about making art, often it sucks because it's like they're overthinking the bits and pieces and how important it will be and the influence it will have, instead of actually letting the creative juices flow. So for me, a lot of self-conscious art rock is, if not unlistenable, it's less pleasurable. With Kraftwerk, though, I think they had something interesting, is the creativity was in the very means of creating it, and then in the limited lyrics, because the lyrics most often are not extensive, and they're more impressionistic, evocative. It's a phrase or something that's said, and it works with the music, sometimes creating dissonance quite purposely to show the contrast within seemingly the country and the mindset, but expressing that through this evolution of their music in the 70s. Where do I have that wrong and right, in your opinion?
I mean, you're dead right about a lot of art rock. It's the same feeling I have about a lot of political art, that it tends to be bad politics and bad art and falls between those two stools because it has to justify itself to neither. But indeed, I do think Kraftwerk's different, and I think it's different for a number of reasons. So they were classically trained musicians, the two at the heart of it, Hutter and Schneider. They understood very clearly the German virtue of discipline. And so in curtailing some of those wanderings and psychedelic experimentations, the imposition of repetition, of rhythm, of beat, etc., but also exploration that comes from it, and the exploration that came, as I said, from the new instruments. But I think also looking back to successful artistic inspirations of the past, and this is highly significant for the identity part as well, is that Hutter is on record as saying, look, we want to make the Bauhaus in electronic sounds. We are the generation of no fathers, only grandfathers. We can't talk about our fathers. we have to go back further. And for them, that was going back to the interwar period and looking at modernism, looking at the Bauhaus, saying there was a German part to this, and we can do something with this. So with a modernist sensibility, but also one informed by further looking back to German music of the Romantic period. So you get references to Beethoven, to Schubert. There's even a song called Franz Schubert by Kraftwerk. And you can see this drawing of references from the past. And there's a guy called David Cunningham who calls it salvaging the lost objects of the better German past, which I think that's the conscious effort that they're drawing that out. Yeah. They clearly also made a conscious effort to be very different, and as an artistic performance, that's clear too. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a second, because for an American audience, there's something I'd like to point out there.
Oh, really? Because to me, growing up in, the Midwest of the United States, I have what I think are accurate memories of seeing Kraftwerk, not in concert, but of seeing them on television and seeing the albums, of course. And the album covers themselves are an expression. They're artistic in a way that I think most artists aim for, but they actually did it, which is it symbolized what was within the album, and it made a statement. But for me, it wasn't that. I just remember seeing pictures of these very odd to me men, all seemingly in haircuts and outfits to look like clones of one another. The one I remember is like bright red shirts and black ties or something like that, which ended up probably merging in my memories with the bands that then, of course, imitated that. Everything from Devo to some of the new wave groups that before they went into the boy band thing where everybody has their own personality. There was a while where some of those bands were very stylistically same in their presentation. That's my thought of the band early on, is the imagery more than the music.
Yes, I mean, this is a Gesamtkunstwerk. It's a total performance, from the art, from the covers, which they designed together with their friend Emil Schult, to the dress, as you rightly said, and you remember it perfectly. It's that chromatic politics. I mean, obviously, red, black, and white in Germany has a particular connotation as well. So they're playing with this all the time. And that one has a double one, because it's not only the colors of the Nazi flag, it was also set up as a homage to the Russian constructivist El Lissitzky. So that album cover with the four of them on the stairs in, as you rightly said, red shirts, black ties, is a constructivist aesthetic that is set up to also look to the international sides of modernism in the 20s. So it's looking at both the 20s and the 30s at the same time. And interestingly, they made quite an impression, despite being so different and so consciously different, and a real strike against what was known as cock rock at the time. So think Led Zeppelin primarily, and anyone around or like Led Zeppelin. They stood stock still on stage. They were absolutely emotionless. And they play with two things there. One is the musical worker, the Musikarbeiter. So there's a collectivist aesthetic there that is challenging something. And they're standing stock still, because there's another reason for that. So they actually had a breakthrough in 1973 with Autobahn as a single, which was remixed for them by on the instructions of a US record producer called Ira Blacker, who visited Hamburg and said, visited Dusseldorf, said, this is going to be great, but you're not going to have a 22-minute record on US radio. Much to the disgust, obviously, of the Kraftwerk guys. And he said, look, I want you to do a 4-minute version. And they swallowed their pride, made the 4-minute version, and it hit top 5 in Billboard. So it actually became popular. On the back of this, they went on tour throughout the US. So they made quite an impact. And they stood there playing their electronic drums, these first ones. And an American journalist said to them, why do you stand so still on stage? And one of them looks at him and says, because in Germany, live music is forbidden.
Almost playing with the naivete of the reporters, right?
Well, yeah, and overplaying the German stereotype.
Right.
And this is how they subverted things, by also doing that. So all of these poses that they're striking are about both avowing and subverting at the same time. So as well as the modernist referencing, there's a very, very postmodern effort to what they're doing, which is about tearing down some of the certainties that are around. But what they keep, interestingly, which is a paradox for some people, is that futurist drive to make things and to create, and the future vision.
Yeah. And what's interesting to me listening to it is, as important as it seems it was to them at the time of creating something truly German, and speaking about issues of German culture and politics and society within the music, I mean, they were still borrowing and bringing in influence and trying to speak to wider issues and other audiences. A lot of the limited lyrics are in English, and you'll hear that. And the Trans Europe Express idea, they're not just talking about Germany for Germans. They seem to have been trying to, in a sense, broaden their impact.
Oh, totally. And this, I think they were way ahead of most international relations theorists on this. They understood very clearly that your identity is firmly in the mirror of others and through the prism of others. And you have to address those perceptions because that is the unrecognized part of a lot of what the Adenauer Republic was trying to do, was to change that perception.
Yeah.
So from sinners in the eyes of the world, eventually to admired society. But that requires changing the minds of others, and it requires changing those relations fundamentally. And so they were really trying to subvert the stereotype of Germans while not forgetting what Germans had done. And so that what for me always made this an immensely valuable intellectual endeavor as well as a really admirable moral endeavor to try and do this. And so they were speaking to European audiences, they were speaking to transatlantic audiences, and they were initially much more popular in the US and or in the UK in particular than they were in Germany. And they influenced a whole raft of synth pop bands and the post-punk bands.
Yeah. I mean, the influence is really interesting because it's very direct with somebody like David Bowie, Eno, others who had been doing some interesting experimental things before, but then you can almost sense after the mid-70s that there's a clear directional shift for some of them there. And then, of course, yeah, the synth pop, almost the new wave, everything from Joy Division, New Order to Depeche Mode. Yeah. You can't hear that now and not hear the through line.
100%, yeah.
But then there's also, the sampling in early rap and hip hop. A lot of that is, and some I think are actually direct samples of the band, but there's definitely an influence there. And of course, then there's electronic house, all of this. Like, it's amazing the musical tree, how much of it has some of its roots here.
Oh, it's wild when you look into it. And they are, I think now acknowledged as the most influential band of the last 50 years. Certainly a lot of music critics would recognize that. And you're right. I mean, Bowie talks specifically about coming back to Europe because of Kraftwerk, turning his attention back to Europe, moving to Berlin, moving to Germany because of Kraftwerk and because of what was going on there. And of course, Bowie's a massive cultural figure who then a lot of the UK bands look to. But interestingly, a lot of them had also seen Kraftwerk on a British popular science show in 1975. So the BBC's Tomorrow's World programme in 1975 features a very callow Kraftwerk playing on there, playing Radioactivity, I think it is. So it's 1975. They're touring in the UK. And bands like OMD, the guys from OMD, who you might have heard of, some of the listeners, they saw Kraftwerk on Tomorrow's World, and then later that week went to see them in person in Liverpool at I think it was opposite the Cavern Club, and you get the seeds of that electronic movement in the UK coming from there. So it's seen in person, but it's mixed in with the greater pop sensibility that they bring. And Kraftwerk acknowledged this. Karl Bartos from the band has said, we thought it was great that the people coming from places we idolized, so Liverpool being the home of the Beatles, would then bring their pop sensibility to meet our music. But they're doing something different than we were doing.
And certainly by the late 70s, there's of course, different musical movements going on, and they were very different. So I'm thinking of bands like Kiss and, the New York Dolls, but that evolved into the hair metal where it was just aggressive machismo and flashy on stage. And it was all about image in a very different way than Kraftwerk was using image. And the very fact that they were focusing on the technology and not moving, and it was almost a direct contrast with that music. And yet there were influences even there in terms of some of the rhythm and things like that. Now, we talked a little bit about influence, and I don't think it's as simple as in the political realm as, a chancellor has his son or daughter bring in radioactivity or bring in the Man Machine, one of these albums, and say, "Hey, Dad, listen to this." And suddenly he has an epiphany and opens up his mind to grand strategy. I don't think it's that simple. But I think the influence that you've started to describe on the German culture and on the idea of, oh, wait a minute, we can talk about our past and make something different from it than either shame or just ignoring it and pretending it didn't happen. There's something in the mindset that then later, the generation that grew up listening to that then has an influence that starts to play out in the 80s and certainly in the 90s.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think anyone would claim there's a linear causality between Kraftwerk having Autobahn and then suddenly you get, Helmut Kohl.
Yeah.
Probably tricky one to justify that. But yeah, I mean, they are representative in some ways of a wider movement. They're also generative of parts of that movement, and through the influence they have. So if you look at the bands on the Berlin scene in the 80s, Mania D, Malaria, these post-punk bands there, Einsturz und Neubauten as well. This is bands who 30 years after Schlager being the norm are not afraid to make music in German, are not afraid to be German, are absolutely not denying their past, but also saying we have a future too. And I think that's the shift that Kraftwerk pioneer. On the influence in other ways that you mentioned, I think on musical terms, yeah, I mean, Kraftwerk are, again, a reaction against this cock rock stuff, against the swaggering, macho, leather pants hero star. They are the submersion of that hero into the collective identity of the band. Now, they're not communist in that sense, but there is definitely something against the figure of the Führer there. There's definitely something against the figure of the strong individual leader
Right.
strutting on stage, which obviously Germans have a particular experience with too. Now, not every German band was doing that. If you look at the metal bands of the 70s in Germany too, I mean, they're doing the same thing. So it's not like this was universal at the time, but they present a different way. What they also do is present a different mode of masculinity, one through mastery of technology. And this is something that catches on in Detroit, for example. So guys like Juan Atkins and Rick Davis, who formed the band Cybertron, who actually give us the theme tune for our podcast, Berlin Side Out, which is Clear, which is an amazing track, showing the back and forth between Germany and elsewhere in the world.
Right.
They take on this model of mastery of technology, and you can see that filtering through in the house music movement. You can see it then coming back in Berlin techno, which draws from Detroit techno.
Wow. And then on the politics side, obviously the world is going on outside of just music. So you have the Cold War still in the 70s and 80s, but with the huge shift in the late 1980s, 1990, with the end of the Cold War, a reunification of Germany, suddenly you have an opportunity for Germany to, not really an opportunity, a requirement for German leaders and people to say, who do we as a country want to be in this brave new world? And music may not have had a direct influence on that, but you can certainly feel that there was an opening of thinking that would have been almost impossible to imagine if the same events would have happened 20 years earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. There was not the same internationally recognized culture industry that Germany had by that time that there had been earlier. There was, again, a shyness among younger people about saying to the world, we are German and this is what we stand for. Whereas 20 years later, there's not. I mean, you can see, the 80s are the decade also of Boris Becker, Steffi Graf, and so on. But they are Germans who are going into a very different context internationally than 20 years previously. I mean, if you think about the reaction in the British press to Kraftwerk, there's some of the article titles are just shocking nowadays. They'll say, the one in the NME about Kraftwerk in 1975, which was actually written by Lester Bangs, the famous music critic, but given a new title by the magazine, was called The Final Solution to the Music Question. And you had another one saying, this is what your fathers fought to save you from.
Oof.
And so that was the kind of reaction. Britain is a particular case. Britain won the war, et cetera, obsessed at a time of its own decline with past glories. But nonetheless, there was a reaction against Germans around the world. And I think Kraftwerk and their heirs and others they enabled were part of changing that and that process of changing minds again. So Germans weren't only sinners in the eyes of the world. So by 1989, they could come out into the world as a proud nation again.
I have a different memory of that immediate post Cold War period when it comes to the intersection of music and international politics. And it involves one band in particular that it probably shows my own limited scope, but it might be representative of what was happening. And that's U2 in Central Europe in the 91 to 1993, 94 period. So Achtung Baby had come out in late 91, I believe, followed by the album Zuropa, which very consciously was trying to talk about the new Europe and what does all of this mean, and basically starting out, I'm so confused. What's happening? I remember being in Prague and Budapest and Munich in very early 1993, and I was hearing U2 everywhere, and Achtung Baby had been out for a year and a half by then. And I just consciously remember that it felt like, here's this band that happened to be Irish, but that was inconsequential. This was the band that people were playing, listening to, almost like a center of gravity for, okay, we're moving forward in a new Europe, and here's a band who's kind of not sure about where it's going either, but we're all listening to it. Now, I have no doubt that, other than my very brief exposure in a few very limited places, that there was much more going on. But to me, that feeling was very strong, that these newly, in some cases, virtually newly independent countries, right, who could chart their own identity for the first time in decades, there was almost this rallying effect around this music, which of course had been influenced by many things pan-European before. I don't know if you remember that era. I'm a little bit older than you, but the influence of U2 here, I think, maybe it's been studied and analyzed, but I haven't seen it. But it sure feels truthy to me.
Yeah, it's a great observation. I hadn't thought of that before, but I think a couple of reflections on what you said. One is Achtung Baby. So a half German title that is given, which again shows then the acceptance of Germany at that time. U2 relocate to Berlin. Mm-hmm. And I mean, people might have different reads on Bono or different takes on Bono, as we know. But he famously said, some bands went to art school. We went to Brian Eno. And that kind of choice, that deliberate pick of who is the coolest now, who is the one who's actually going to bring us there, where is the best place we can be, very clear, rational decision-making on their part, strikes me as entirely in keeping with that. And that move, I mean, the Achtung Baby famously about the Edge's divorce, as well as about the change of the situation in Europe, the change of the old couple, if you like, the East and the West in Europe, and that split rendered in Berlin. You go to Zuropa, you get the much more, as you say, confused, numb, daddy's going to pay for your crash car, etc., far away, so close, what is it, how do we know it, everything, all bets off. Certainly speaks to me about that time as well. And you're right, I'm a few years younger, so I didn't see it in person for a few years until I went to Prague first time in 2001. But you could clearly see that there was a moment there, and that almost the disavowal of U2's identity from their early period, where you look at Bloody Sunday, you look at a lot of the songs that are highly political at that time, New Year's Day, about Poland, etc., going towards being a much more globalized band, let's say, going towards being a band of many influences appealing across many, many countries. I think there's something to be explored in that. They also rode a lot of musical waves too. So I think very interesting observation.
Yeah, I do remember after that, I think it was the Pop album that they took a longer time to record. So maybe 97 or 98, Pop came out, and it was a different sound. Whereas Achtung Baby and Zuropa, yes, they weren't as raw as the early U2 albums. You could still hear them as you could imagine the band just playing these songs live with a few extra little bells and whistles from Eno along the way. But Pop sounded different. And I have in my memory a review. I know it existed, but I have not gone back to find it again. But there was some review, and I think it was of the Pop album, that said, U2 used to sound important. Now they just sound expensive.
Oh,
And I
Brutal.
thought, okay, that's an interesting take because to me, pop probably is the one that incorporates some of the things like Kraftwerk the most. It has more of the, if you will, techno beats and things that are an evolution of that. And yet by that point, it had gone from the early 90s when U2 was almost seen as this symbol of European Renaissance and where are we going, to by the end of the decade, people saying, yeah, this is too formulaic and too mechanical.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I think it's about being ahead of the curve or behind the curve, isn't
Yeah.
it? And by 97, 98, that's when we first started going to house clubs. I mean, in 96, I thought
Mhm.
95, dare I say, due to some creative work on our part, we managed to start going to house clubs. And you got a very different kind of cutting edge music
Yeah,
there than you got from Discotheque on the pop album, for
right.
example. And you got it feeling authentic and feeling real, which I think by that stage, indeed, you two felt expensive
Yeah, yeah,
versus actually what everyone was doing in their daily
yeah.
life.
So back to German identity and how it expresses itself in foreign policy.
Mhm.
You have seemingly more open reckoning of this in the 90s and trying to decide what are we going to do, and the conversations that followed in the decades about NATO expansion and what's Germany's role going to be here. But it still seemed like, and I think you've written on this, that German grand strategy was still missing or underdeveloped, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think after 89, that's when you start to get the problems of German grand strategy. It's at the very moment of triumph. And there's a few people who've written about this in Germany, talking about Germany as the end of history country, as the one that went most with the Fukuyamian thesis of the end of history, surrounded now by friends, so many options. Okay, let's go make lots of money. And we don't have to really pay for security anymore. Reap the peace dividend. Disband the mighty Bundeswehr as it was: 500,000 men under arms, 5,000 main battle tanks,
Yeah.
a frontline state, and armed to look like it. That all goes, and instead you get the expansion of both the EU and the enlargement of the EU and NATO against German objections initially, which are then overturned once I think the two things. The better side is the responsibility for the past is seen and reckoned with in relation to Central Eastern Europe, and figures like Lech Wałęsa, but also Václav Havel were key in talking to German leaders about this and pushing them further. But also the money-making opportunity was pretty clear. And
Mm.
so building further the EU in Germany's image, ensuring Germany benefits the most from this as the mighty economic powerhouse in the middle, which would benefit from being able to outsource production to cheaper, lower cost countries in Central Eastern Europe that are close, that German companies could buy, and then leverage that to boost Germany's export power even further than it was before. Put that together with buying Russian gas and importing cheap energy that way, and the emergence of China as a massive import market as well as a production place as well for German companies, and the whole mode of globalization at that time. And you get Germany basically riding a wave rather than trying to influence it.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
betting on that convergence wager that says if we have liberal economics, we will get liberal politics and liberal
Yeah.
democracy.
So at the some level, this thinking, this strategy actually worked because by 2020, there was a pan-European poll that showed that Germany was what, the most respected country in the world?
Yeah, this was actually a global poll,
Uh-huh.
amazingly.
Okay.
135 countries, I think, participated in this poll. And yeah, 2020, Germany comes out as the most respected country in the world, an
Yeah.
outcome pretty unimaginable in 1950. And so again, it
Right.
shows that transition.
Yep.
This is what I think gave a lot of the German elite a false sense of security and a false sense of satisfaction. Everything they were doing seemed to have worked. They seemed to have been proved right. And that 2020 is an interesting year because it comes 15 years into the Merkel reign,
Hmm.
which is now widely seen, of course, as a period of stagnation, a period of geopolitical error, but also of domestic stagnation,
Hmm.
crucially for this argument.
Yeah.
And I would look at this and say Germany did such a great job of reinventing itself across the board, politically, economically, culturally, socially, during the period 45 to 89. It then, as a loose generalization, said, okay, this is who we are now. We have got everything to be proud of, and rightly so. Let's just carry on and let's milk that.
Right.
Not realizing that the world would also change. And so a lot of these modus operandi outlived their usefulness, but people in Germany didn't realize it, and they outlived their relevance, and people in Germany didn't realize it, which is why come 2020, 2021, especially 2022, you get a horrible shock when the change of the world becomes more manifest. It should have been clear in 2014, should have perhaps been clear in 2008 to many, but 2014 certainly, it should have been clear when the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of the Donbass by Vladimir Putin. But of course, after that, Germany goes ahead and authorizes Nord Stream 2, doubles down on investment in China, etc., does not change, does not rearm, does not spend money on defense, carries on the same mode in the European Union of power through denial, if you like, and of exporting stagnation. And this becomes a real problem now when trying to change Germany, because during that time, its strategic capacity, capacity to generate things like Westbindung or even Ostpolitik, really atrophied because it seemed as though all the big questions had been answered. And a lot of the sort of cut and thrust, the most cutting and thrusting Germans went into business rather than into politics or into the kind of places where you would get this deep strategic thinking. And so come the time for the need for a change, it's very difficult to find where that's going to come from. And it's also, I think, overwhelming to a lot of German decision makers to say, holy shit, do we have to change this across the board? Domestic economics, international economics, security, defense, and our societal cohesion as well, because we got to talk about migration in a serious way. It's come as a perfect storm for Germany because of having hit cruise control for so long.
Yeah. You mentioned Merkel in there, and Chancellor for more than 16 years. And perhaps the easy answer is to say, well, it's her fault. She should have been able to see past this. She had the experience. She had the solid enough foundation to stay in that role for so long that there's no excuse. But I don't think it was just a Merkel problem. I think it was most of the political leadership was, in a sense, I don't know what you want to call it, sleepwalking, going on inertia, lacking the creativity. And yet there were the spurs for it. Like you mentioned, 2014, 2017, there issues happened that were a spur to others in Europe. And yet it was a German problem. How much of it do you attribute to her and her leadership? And how much of it do you say, yes, we can fairly evaluate her and the missed opportunities, but it was a larger issue and she was a part of it?
Yeah, definitely the latter. It was a larger issue. She was a part of it. She was a particular figurehead for that approach. So I wouldn't let her off the hook completely. I wouldn't submerge her in world historical process because she also helped shape that context. But the problem was much larger. And we've seen that with the Olaf Scholz government afterwards. Yeah. When Scholz campaigned, I don't know if you saw this advert, the little Merkel thing she did with the router here, the Merkel rhombus. Scholz had a campaign poster where he's doing the same thing, saying,
really?
Ich kann Kanzlerin, which means literally in German, I can be the female chancellor. And I mean, the psychoanalyst's nightmare, this poster.
There are whole dissertations being written on that.
I hope so.
Yeah.
But that really shows that continuity was seen as good, that Merkel was seen as that prize from the establishment there. And this was a much wider problem because, and I genuinely think because Germany had been so successful previously, and then a generation came in that didn't see the need for change. There was a lot of greed as well, let's be honest on this. There was a lot of opportunity to make a lot of money for certain elements of German business who could do well out of seeming to do good. Now that, I mean, of course, is a political dream if you can do that. So paying off your historical debt to Russia, wow. Never mind about your historical debt to Ukraine, never mind about your historical debt to Central Eastern Europe there, those get overlooked in this process. But the whole thing with Nord Stream and with ties with Russia in general was painted as part of the historical renewal and the historical reckoning process. But I think that had already been largely taken care of in the Bonn Republic, which did a much better job of it. and actually stood up for Germany's security interests, and rather than selling out the country. So you get this sort of haunted afterlife of the good things of the Bonn Republic in an economy that hollows itself out, that sells itself out elsewhere, a reckoning process that is really nothing of the sort and just undermines, and a society that is trading on past glory. Now, there was enough of that to continue to go around, and there were some good things that Merkel did, of course, and I think she was also flattered by comparison at the time to others. There weren't a lot of strong leaders around Europe or the US after 2008, let's say. So she looked like a reasonable continuity figure, stability, etc. This was all prized at times of what we thought back then were crises. And over those happy days. And so stability comes to be prized, but in retrospect, you can really see it as stagnation. And a few of us did point to aspects of this at the time, but it was very difficult here, certainly, to push that too far. You had to always give proper credit to Mutti first. Yeah.
Well, of course, then we get to February of 2022, and the shock that comes to so many, especially in German leadership and around. Now, within days, as I recall, Olaf Scholz came out and gave his Zeitenwende speech. And first of all, talk about that concept. What was the speech? What was the idea and the feeling about the recognition and the change that it represented? And then we'll have the huge disappointment that has come since. But first, talk about that speech, the concept behind it, how it was received in the country, and what it seemed like it was turning.
A slight spoiler alert there. As a friend of mine, a religious studies graduate, said, as a theologian, I encourage people not to speak about what doesn't exist. So the Zeitenwende we might put into that context. Zeitenwende is not up there yet with Blitzkrieg or Kindergarten as those German words that everyone knows. And I think it probably won't end up being eventually. But what the idea behind this was that it was a sea change in German geostrategy, a sea change in Germany's geopolitical positioning, a sea change in German defense policy after years of neglect. Germany finally getting serious again about the hard edges of geopolitics, about standing up to authoritarian states, getting off Russian gas, rearming, taking a stronger role in the EU and NATO, etc. So there's a whole raft of measures that we've analysed at great length about the Zeitenwende, all of which were in that initial speech on the 27th of February, a special Sunday session of the Bundestag. And anyone who lives in Germany knows that doing things on a Sunday is not necessarily national sport number one here. The shops are all closed. You can't go shopping in a German town on Sunday. So opening up the Bundestag on Sunday really meant something was up. Yeah. And Scholz announced this supposed transformation, including a 100 billion euro special fund for the Bundeswehr, which is widely heralded by allies. Now, when some of us did even say at the time, 100 billion to fix a 600 billion hole might be tricky to do the math on that one.
But it seemed important because it was such a dramatic shift so quickly that even though it was only 100 billion, it still seemed like this is it. This is Germany suddenly and quickly in a way that we would not have imagined turning and playing a new role.
That was the hope. And that was really the hope, was to use this to push on to what Germany should indeed be doing as a responsible alliance member, as a potential security leader in Europe in a time of security crisis. It seemed perhaps like a change because the starting point was so low. I mean, remember, just a few days before, Olaf Scholz had been saying, we will send 5,000 helmets to Ukraine. Cue widespread ridicule. A few days before, he'd still been saying, or a month or so before, Nord Stream is a purely private sector project.
Right.
Again, laughed at by Central Eastern Europe. But this is what a lot of German analysts and politicians point to and saying, look how far we've come. And you said, well, yeah, but actually being so far behind in the first place is not an excuse for still not being up to speed now. So I think it's important not to let that debate get framed in the wrong way. Nonetheless, there was seen as a moment of shift. And my read on this is, look, that speech was written and given in a moment of panic in Berlin. It was a time when it looked like to many people here in the government analyzing things that Kiev was going to fall
Yeah.
pretty quickly, and that an emboldened Russia would be knocking at the door. And so it's time to get serious. The Ukrainians fight back and buy time, and the air goes out of this process of change almost completely. You have Scholz then spending a year and a half trying to walk back what he said, trying to equivocate on this, equivocate on that. And we wrote a report, or I wrote a report based on this 2-year research program that we'd had at the German Council on Foreign Relations at the end of August, called The End of the Zeitenwende, saying, and the first line in it is Germany's Zeitenwende has failed. And across those 5 elements, I think you can point to real failure. The only one where you could say maybe is diversification away from Russian gas. But I mean, don't forget that the Russians turned off the tap.
Now, there is an interesting contrast here. And yes, circumstances are very different for many, many reasons. So methodologically, this may be flawed, but conversationally, it's instructive. To compare what Germany did before February 2022 and then with this effort to Poland. Sketch that out for us briefly, just to show what can be done.
Yeah, focusing on the military dimension of this.
Yeah.
Poland has engaged in a rearmament program in the time since the Zeitenwende speech was given that Germany is still talking about doing.
Right.
And so you're looking at Polish defense spending now up above 4.3% of GDP. Next year, it's going to be 4.7% of GDP. You can see the procurement of things like tanks at scale. So Poland's bought more than 1,000 tanks. This was decided upon in 2022. The contract was signed in 2022. The last of those tanks produced in Poland, so part of a value sharing deal, will be delivered in 2026. And that's alongside the procurement of the Apaches, the procurement of the JASSMs, the procurement of the howitzers, etc., etc., etc. Whereas in Germany, let's just say things are not going as quickly as that. And although Germany will be at 2% of spending, 2% of GDP on defense spending this year and next, under current plans, it's uncertain after that whether it would continue to be, and certainly not beyond 2027 when this special fund runs out. And given that 2% is widely seen now as an outdated target and very much a floor rather than a ceiling, the struggle to maintain that is really indicative of the failure of the Zeitenwende, I think.
This is something that just occurred to me, and I run the risk that it's a catastrophically, galactically stupid question, but I don't know the German political system very well. But is there something inherent in the role of the chancellor and the powers of the chancellor and the ability to execute that disincentivizes at a minimum or even inhibits strong strategic shift?
Very interesting you should mention that. Not a stupid question at all. And it's something I meant to allude to earlier when you talked about constraints on Germany that were actually imposed by the Constitution of 49, agreed with the Allied occupying powers, that are supposed to limit the powers of German government. They distribute them around the federal states, still very strong regional identity, strong regional government. But as we've seen over the years, a series of strong chancellors who could actually conceive and execute grand strategy. Konrad Adenauer, Willy Brandt, Helmut Schmidt, Helmut Kohl, all of whom exercised strong leadership. Even, it must be said, Gerhard Schröder, before he became a Gazprom shill, and actually a chancellor who did have a transformative agenda, the Neue Mitte, the equivalent of the New Labour or Third Way, Bill Clinton type agenda in Germany. So, and it's been seen also in the last 2 years with Olaf Scholz exercising what is called Richtlinienkompetenz, another one of those wonderful German words that will, haunt your dreams, saying, actually, despite what all you, my coalition ministers, think, I'm going to force this through, and I've got the majority to do it. And if you go against me, basically, the coalition is up. And he's done that twice in this coalition governing period, which is quite unusual to force that through. It's also been an unusual time because there's been a 3-party coalition in Germany for the first time. So there has been more fractiousness. But Olaf Scholz very clearly made foreign and security policy so-called Chefsache, or the boss's stuff to deal with, put the l'état c'est moi He was very much in charge of this and has let everyone know it. So I don't actually think that's the reason for lack of change. I think there's been a deliberate strategy that has been played, and I think it's a bad strategy.
Right.
The inability to challenge that strategy has been the problem.
You've written that reform-minded Germans see a government that moves not at its own strategically planned pace, but at the speed of shame. Harsh, but seemingly accurate based on available facts. And when I look at German, well, casually, when I look at German foreign policy leadership and potential successors to Scholz, I see Boris Pistorius, who I don't know much about, but what I hear him saying and what I think lies behind it sounds encouraging in several respects. And that's it. Like, I literally can't think of anybody else on the political stage that I can say with any confidence would escape this trap of moving at the speed of shame and going, almost being dragged through things. I'm just not seeing that leadership. Am I missing someone or something in the German political scene there?
It's always nice to be reminded of one's own words. That's one that will live. Yeah, it went down, let's say, better in some parts of Berlin than others, that
Yeah.
phrase, but it did resonate here because that was at a time, it was written in October 2022, when every big decision on sending weapons to Ukraine, Germany had not taken on its own. It had been bounced into by others, heaping the pressure on. Unfortunately, in March this year, we were able to write in another piece, the shaming will continue until policy improves. And mutiny on the bounty
Brilliant.
reference for those listeners out there who know that one.
Yeah.
And sadly, this has been the problem because it looks like Scholz's government has just been reacting rather than actually taking ownership of decisions in advance that it would have to take basically anyway. So it doesn't get the credit for them. And so it creates this really unfortunate dynamic where that's how allies think you get Germany to do stuff. And there was a kickback against that, very lame kickback against that in 2023, where basically the Chancellery put it around the whole of Europe to say, we don't respond well to criticism, conveniently enough. And some bought this more than others. As you'll have seen from the Central Eastern European approach, not many there bought into that. Others around Western Europe took the gloves off a bit. Ukraine has been up and down on that, but it's been interesting to see how they've not been able to deal with it. Very quickly, I think they are actually pursuing a strategy there. I do think they have a plan, which is a continuity play from pre-2022. They want to actually keep as much of that world from which Germany did very well as possible. I don't think that's possible. I don't think it's credible given the changing geopolitical circumstance. That is their plan. Nonetheless, they've been bounced into a load of changes that don't fit with that plan. And so this is why moving at the speed of shame. Now, on leadership, Boris Pistorius has been a very impressive figure. He's from the same party as Olaf Scholz, grew up in the same town as Olaf Scholz. Very different character, able to communicate clearly, empathetically, to speak in strong terms about issues that have been supposedly difficult for other German leaders to speak of. So he said quite early on in his appointment back in February 23, Ukraine should win the war, something that Olaf Scholz still hasn't said. He said that Germany needs to be kriegstüchtig, or war ready. Now, to tell Germans, you've got to be war ready, that was a big step, and it is something he's continued to back up and said that we will need to spend 3% more, maybe, on GDP on defense. So he's not been pulling his punches, and he specifically refers to his experience as a Cold War kid, growing up in a frontline state. Very differently than Olaf Scholz does. So Olaf Scholz, as a young socialist, famously went traveling to the east, met with the Communist Party people there, was against NATO dual track. Boris Pistorius, very different, much more sort of NATO-friendly experience, let's say. In terms of other leaders, Friedrich Merz, who is the leader of the Christian Democrats, who is likely to be the next chancellor, barring a huge shock in the next election, has held many positions across different issues. And it would be interesting to see which Friedrich Merz turns up when governed. Recently, he's been making a lot of strong statements on Ukraine and on defense. I've yet to see a credible position on China from him, which will be a big issue for Germany dealing with its economy going forward. And I don't necessarily know if allies are going to get a better deal out of a Friedrich Merz-led government in general. To see what role Germany would pursue. He's certainly more forthright than Olaf Scholz, but is he actually a leader? For the Greens, Robert Habeck and Annalena Baerbock have not been able to impose themselves. They've not been able to win arguments at the level of government to push things through. And I think the Greens are in a period of renewal, which will either lead them to them retreating into themselves to issues that appeal only to their base, or genuinely becoming a mainstream party. And I'm not sure those are necessarily the leaders who will carry that process through, even if they've started it.
So it seems to me that more likely than not is, in a sense, a continuation of this. I don't want to say foot dragging, that's too simplistic, but you're not seeing a bright light in the coming year of a resurgence of German strategic thinking. And that's unfortunate, right?
Yeah, I mean, the good thing is there are people who understand this across the four main democratic parties. Whether that's the SPD, there are some, the Liberal Free Democrats, the Greens, or the CDU, and their Bavarian cousins, the CSU. In all those parties, we speak to people who understand the problem and who want to become more effective strategic actors. And that's why we set up the Democratic Strategy Initiative to actually help that process along. And it's encouraging also that Germans seem to want this. So focus groups that we conducted back in early 2024 and through the spring showed that a lot of Germans think that their country's in decline and they want someone to do something about it. And they want Germany's influence to grow again. They want Germany's foreign policy to be guided by being part of the democratic world. And playing a strong role in that. So I think there is both a political market, and there are some politicians who are not at the very top level at the moment, but who would be effective leaders if they could be brought through, who could deliver that kind of change. I would foresee a change in tone and possibly a change in transactional cooperation between Germany and others with a change of government, but there are big underlying issues they need to fix of exactly the kind we talked about before. So there's a reinvention of Germany is needed once again. So we need a new Kraftwerk too.
Yeah. Well, I have one other thought, but I do want to make a note that I will include a link to the Democratic Strategy Initiative in the show notes so people can see the work you're doing now on that front. But my final thought on this that we've been talking about is, even if you have a bold, creative, assertive, consistent German leader who is leading, but also in some ways capturing public opinion on the need for this and showing a leadership role, I'm not sure who would follow Germany in Central and Eastern Europe after what they've seen in the last few decades, because the lack of confidence that will come even from a strong leadership desire when you have had leaders, whether it's in Poland, in Estonia, in Finland, in Sweden, people who seem to have their heads around this in a much more constructive fashion. What do you think?
Totally right. I mean, I've spent a lot of my career in Central Eastern Europe, and seeing the change in attitude towards Germany in the last 3 years has been remarkable. The scales have fallen from people's eyes. The deference has gone. There is a very clear understanding that European security would be much easier to get right if Germany was on board and playing its full role as a team member. But what's changed now, and I think this is perhaps Europe's true Zeitenwende, is that no one's waiting for Germany to do that, and they're happy to go ahead without if necessary, because those countries are moving at the pace that is required by the geopolitical situation, and they no longer want to be held back by having to move at the pace of the slowest. And so it was often commented that it was unfortunate that the German government collapsed straight after Trump's election, when Europe needs strong leadership. The idea that Germany would provide that strong leadership under Olaf Scholz at this time was pure fantasy. And so I think it's actually done everyone a favor by effectively getting Germany out of the way for a short time so others can actually form the kind of coalition of the willing that is needed to drive European security forward. Now, there's a strong role, as I say, for Germany to play as a team player in future if it gets its act together. But the assumption that they will be leaders is simply not founded.
So, Ben, I want to thank you for joining me for all this. This has been a rich discussion on so many different issues, from music to culture to foreign policy. But we can't let you go yet because we have our chatterbox, and the chatterbox is wise. So it will have a question for you. Hitting something we oddly did not in all of this. Who played the best James Bond?
Wow. Okay. That's such a great question. So probably totally unpopular opinion on this one. So the first James Bond I saw in the cinema was Goldeneye, and I absolutely love Pierce Brosnan in Goldeneye.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's superb. And even if the films he was in after that were not great, probably my favorite single Bond is Pierce Brosnan in that. I think he channels a bit of the early Connery, who everyone loves.
Yeah.
Roger Moore, not quite my thing. Timothy Dalton's pretty good, but I go with Pierce Brosnan.
Yeah, that's not the most common answer that I've heard to this question, but I understand it, and part of it is just the formative experience. What do you see first, and is it a positive or a negative experience that does govern your opinion from that point out? You're comparing, in a sense, Connery to Pierce Brosnan because you saw him first.
No, exactly right. And I thought he was able to channel that really well in that he got the smooth stuff. He crashed a tank through St. Petersburg. It was incredible.
Come on.
Yeah,
right?
There was Statue Park. I mean, it's a great movie.
That's excellent.
Who's your favorite Bond, David?
Oh, it's tough. I go back and forth. I enjoy the Connery movies probably more than almost all of them. To me, that's iconic. I think Daniel Craig in some ways might be closest to the novels, just because of the kind of the gritty, dark brooding behind it, which Roger Moore, of course, didn't capture at all. And yet I still like some of those Roger Moore movies. They're still fun. So it's more, it's more for me, what is true to Ian Fleming is one way of measuring that. But that gives me a different answer than what do I love to just sit and watch as pure entertainment.
Oh, totally.
Very curious. I don't know who the perfect Bond would be, but I do think there's something so compelling about the character as written that I would love to see a future Bond as realistic as possible to be that person. And if they want to be more modern with a Jane Bond or something else, that they just create a separate character and a separate series. But I think I'm in the minority on that. There seems to be a big movement to try to diversify Bond.
Yeah, interesting point. And it raises the question, is this a transferable character because it's been played by different people in the past, all of whom share certain identity characteristics? Is it defined by those? Is it essentialized to that?
Yeah.
I mean, the way Fleming was writing it back in the day, yes, it is, because that person would have particular relations to the world, and the world around them would treat them in certain ways. I think there's room for spies of all kinds on film, but yeah, for me, James Bond is also James Bond.
Right on. Well, again, thank you for being so generous with your time and your insights. We'll refer people to the Democratic Strategy Initiative and to some of your writings as well in the show notes. Ben, thanks.
Hey, David, it's been great to talk to you. Really love to come on. Thanks a lot.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter at ThatWasChatter.